So I think that deep understanding of what your role is really critical as a very first step. And then I would say, second, we have to be leaders to ourselves first. So we have to lead ourselves first. And that means balancing and having the ability to engage. And so we have to get ourselves into a healthy emotional space where we can have those conversations that we need to have, that we can lead ourselves first. And then we're able to engage with those people around us to educate them about what we do and why we do it in a way that we can be received.
Hey there, and welcome to the Speechy Side Up podcast. My name is Vanita Litvack, and I am so grateful you're here. I'm an ASHA certified speech language pathologist, author, and augmentative and alternative communication consultant who is obsessed with helping SLPs like you stop reinventing the wheel and connect with other SLPs in the trenches. Have you ever wondered how other SLPs seem to be doing it all with ease? Well, around here, you'll get to hear firsthand how SLPs are really getting things done while keeping evidence-based practice and self-care in mind. Think of this as a coffee date with your SLP friends. Get ready to be challenged and encouraged while we learn together.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Laura Mansfield, who has over 20 years of experience in education, working 13 years as an SLP in mainly public as well as private and clinic settings, and 10 years of experience as a special education administrator. In January of 2021, she returned to the classroom as an SLP with a doctorate in educational leadership and a wealth of administrative experience that shaped the way she approached the role. She is passionate about helping other public school SLPs find joy in their positions while making the greatest impact possible for the students they serve. She is also an adjunct instructor and quantitative methodologist for Liberty University School of Education and the owner of the Joyful SLP that provides coaching services and courses for school-based SLPs. Laura, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, do you feel like that covered everything, or is there anything else you want to add before we talk about your tips for finding joy as a public school SLP?
I think that covered a lot. I think I just am noticing more and more, especially in online spaces, how much burnout my colleagues who are public school SLPs are feeling. And they really seem to be very overwhelmed about what they feel to be increasing responsibilities as a school-based SLP. And I feel like because I was a special ed administrator and then came back into the classroom as an SLP, it gave me a different lens. And it's really my goal to help SLPs find systems that streamline what they're doing so that they can have joy in their jobs that they work so hard to get this degree to attain and this job to do. And then if they decide to leave, okay. But I don't want them to leave because they feel like they just can't do it anymore, especially because so many are such giving, loving, caring, compassionate human beings who really want to make a difference. And I just feel like there's a better way.
I feel like you and I are on the same mission because I was also in the schools and overwhelmed, and I could see, and then I was in a supportive role at the district level, supporting other SLPs. And I just felt for them, like, having 110 kids on your caseload, like that's too much for anybody. But I do think that there is a balance and it doesn't require leaving the field of speech language pathology, like you mentioned, with the degree that you've paid for and worked hard for. And the grass isn't always greener on the other side. And a lot of other fields have similar problems,
Such a good
overworked,
point.
underpaid. And so it's like finding pockets in our field that may work better for somebody. It's a systematic problem at the school level, but I'm excited to hear your tips for kind of working with what you've got and making it a better situation for yourself. So, what are some important personal mindset shifts we can make as public school SLPs?
Well, I think one of the things that really tripped me up when I first started as an SLP in the public schools was differentiating what my role was. Because in school, what's not language? Everything's language in schools. And kids are impacted by their language disability or communication impairments across all areas, right? Educational, behavioral, social, emotional. So, really figuring out what my role was really hard And I don't think I understood that as an SLP who with a clinical background as a healthcare professional, clinically trained person, I was now entering an organization that was educational. And there's a difference in how I qualify students and how I determine which students to see and which students I might just consult or maybe not even require my services because of the organizational system of education that I'm now operating in. And I think we understand that on a surface level, but it actually makes practical differences if you truly understand your role in an educational system as this clinician. And I think that is a really important mindset shift to make and to be really comfortable, which I wasn't as a young SLP. And before I was an administrator, to really tease out what my role was as an SLP, to be confident in um, educating teachers, my administrators, my parents, what my role was as an SLP in the school. So I think that that deep understanding of what your role is really critical as a very first step. And then I would say second is it's so funny. I've had other administrators as an SLP tell me that SLPs, they're afraid of us. They make me nervous. They have all these demands. And I think that creates a barrier sometimes when we're trying to get the resources that we need or be understood, because sometimes we miss the fact that we're operating within their educational system. And it's easy to forget that not everyone knows what we know and to not figure out like, what do we know that they don't know? And so we have to be leaders to ourselves first. So we have to lead ourselves first. And that means, balancing and having the ability to engage. I think it's funny sometimes, like we are communication experts, but we can really struggle to have hard conversations and to model what that looks like for our colleagues. And so we have to do that. We have to get ourselves into a healthy emotional space where we can have those conversations that we need to have, that we can lead ourselves first, and then we're able to engage with those people around us to educate them about what we do and why we do it in a way that we can be received, which sometimes can be hard.
Yeah, those are all really great points. Do you have some type of document that takes a deeper look at what the SLP's role is in the school within the educational framework?
So I do have a document called Qualifying Students for Eligibility that goes into the medical versus educational model. And so that is at thejoyfulslp.com/qualify. And then I also did a YouTube video about what it means to be a related service provider in the school, where I try and really dive into how to distinguish what our role is. So hopefully that could be supportive for SLPs listening.
Oh, yeah, I think that would be really helpful for anybody that's listening. Because I think, like you said, especially if someone's coming from a different setting and then starting to work in school for a first time, it's a lot to learn, like on the fly, and then provide therapy, attend IEP meetings, complete your paperwork. There's a lot to get familiarized with. So I think a cheat sheet like that would be
Yes.
really helpful.
And I think it's easy to get confused in schools because so there's the federal law, then there's your state law, but then there's district practices. And sometimes I think that the way an administrator wants something done is because of a practice, not a law.
Mm,
And if we don't educate ourselves directly, what is my responsibility under the law? Then how do we talk about it? We end up kind of getting, tossed around in the waves of like, well, this wants it this way and this wants it that way. And there is a way to educate yourself, make sure you're really clear on what your role and responsibilities are. Because I think a lot of administrators are actually looking to us to help them understand, because most administrators, if you are fortunate, you've been able to work for an administrator who was a speech language pathologist, and it just makes it a lot easier because they get us. But a lot of administrators or teachers don't really understand our training. They don't know, what our master's degree involves. They don't understand the expertise that we have, and they're overwhelmed with their responsibilities and trying to move their whole classroom of students forward. And then sometimes I think they feel like we're one more thing, depending on how we approach things. And so I think there is a better way that we can come alongside teachers and administrators to help them understand what our role is and how we can support them in their goals and what they're trying to do for the students.
yeah, absolutely. It's like if you don't have a clear picture on what your role is, then somebody's going to tell you what it is. And of
Yep.
course, you're looking to your supervisor on what is expected of you. But I think you're right when it comes to speech language pathologists within the school setting, knowing what the law stipulates is going to be very important because the administrator most likely will not understand what an SLP's role is.
And especially when we don't. And then
Yeah.
there's that's one layer. And then the other layer is what is the curriculum in your school? Because our role as speech pathologists is to provide access in the federal law under the IDEA to what's happening either in the curriculum or for students who have more functional needs, right? Their ability to interact with other students, which I think is easier sometimes because there's no one else working on those things. It makes it really clear that that's our role. But when it's curriculum based and it's in literacy or writing or, understanding a math story or vocabulary, those can be more shades because sometimes as a special education teacher that might work on those skills. But we are working within a curriculum. And I know sometimes there's concerns of SLPs that I've worked with about that the curriculum that's being used isn't addressing the needs of a student, but we can't out intervention poor tier one instruction. We are still operating within that system. And my job is access to that system. And so I can educate others and might work with my administrators on a better option for curriculum that meets the needs of more students. And I think we are uniquely educated to be able to do that for students. And I think we should do that for students. But I think there's a way to do it where we're received and a way to do it where we're perceived as someone we're afraid of. Like, I don't understand what it is that they're talking about. And I think that that distinction is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what are some tips that you have for developing positive relationships with administrators and teachers in the public schools?
So I have definitely worked with teachers who have not wanted me in their classroom and right, who are difficult to engage with. When I took the position that I most recently left administration and went into, I had a really high caseload. I was servicing most students not involved with the classroom. It was all in my room. I felt really disconnected. So over 3 years, I was able to change from mostly, I'm going to call it a medical model of pullout only to a more integrated model using the 3-1 method. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's basically 3 weeks in my classroom. This is for most students, not all, but 3 weeks in my therapy room, 1 week out into the classrooms. And what that allowed me to do was to observe what was happening in classrooms and build my relationships, the trust that teachers had of how I could support their students in the work that they were doing in the classroom. So my very first kind of position is always one of humility and that I'm seeking first to understand before I'm asking to be understood. I wanted teachers to see me as a resource, not one more thing that they had to do. And so everything that I did in that role had that aim. So asking teachers if students were struggling, how could I support them? I created little cheat sheets for my students to tell teachers how their disability might show up for them in the classroom in a really easy way that they could read easily and understand. And then ask them, like, are you seeing any of that? How can I better support you? What supports might work for you? How can I bridge this gap for the student in your classroom? So I think that's the first thing. Even for teachers who were more prickly, I always assume good intentions. I think that that just helps to not take things personally. Everyone's working really hard, and almost 98% of the people that I've worked with just want what's best for students. They might have a different approach or not understand what I bring to the table, and that's okay. We still all want the same thing. We want our students to be successful. So I think those are like my top two shifts I think that I made from before when I was an SLP to becoming an administrator and then going back in the classroom. And then I also think just being confident and knowing what my role is also provided clarity for the teacher in what I could do, what I could support them with, why I was making the decisions I was making for students. And I developed my own systems in terms of using certain strategies for kids who had more dysarticulation issues versus using contextualized language therapy, using books for my more involved language students. And it just really helped being in the classroom really helped me connect what I was doing with students in my therapy room with classroom. And then I think my teacher saw that my kids were making progress and that what I was doing was connected. And then that helped as well for that positive relationship. It's really hard when you're isolated in your room all the time to build relationships. You really have to be intentional.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. So, what do you think is the biggest mistake SLPs make in caseload management in public schools?
I think that it's really easy to fall into a medical framework where everybody gets 2 times 30. I'm not sure where that even came from. Do you know where 2 times 30 came from?
Well, and like recent research talks about how even the frequency of like once a week or like once every 2 weeks or even once a month is just as effective. So it is interesting. But I'm sure it came from insurance, right?
Probably, right? And
Yeah.
Medicaid billing. And some states have a requirement of a minimum, I think, of 7 minutes in order to bill. So if districts are billing, then they have those kinds of restrictions. But I think breaking out of that 2 times 30 is for everybody. Again, going back to really understanding what your role is, what skill you're addressing. So for me, like I went to like that speed speech model for my articulation students. And if they only had one sound, by the time they got to one sound, I was really decreasing to once a week for 5 minutes, but I could get 100 to 150 trials in 5 minutes with a student. I was so much more effective than trying to fit, 5 kids in one group for 30 minutes once a week where they weren't all getting that drill and I couldn't really hone in on their specific formation of a sound. So I think thinking outside of the box around what your role is so that you better understand how you're supporting students within the educational framework is important because sometimes I think we are over servicing students or we get sometimes some SLPs work in districts where they're very litigious and then there's a lot of fear around missing students. So having good conversations around, well, what does the student actually need for this specific skill that I'm teaching? Can I write it monthly? Can I write it across a year? That gives more flexibility for missed sessions. Does it make sense for me to be in the classroom as opposed to pull out? Does it make sense for me to just collaborate with maybe the special education teacher or the regular education teacher around this specific skill that they need to practice actually in the context of when they're needing it, as opposed to with me in an isolated context? And I think sometimes we want to help. Like, I think we're a lot of helpers in this field, and we feel a pressure, I think, to work on everything for all kids. And so I think we can overservice and maybe actually provide services that aren't really related to the classroom. And so I think we make some mistakes in that as well.
Yeah. And you have those kids that you like a lot too, right? So, maybe sometimes they are getting more service than they need when you could have somebody else in there who probably needs it more or, you know, yeah.
Yeah. It can be
It's an
hard to let our
interesting
little
thought.
birds fly.
I know, I know. It's true. I like what you said about breaking out of that 2 times a week for 30 minutes for every client. I think that that's a good place to start for people if they on average, most of their students are 2 times a week for 30 minutes, like, really need to take a look and think about, is that necessary for all of these students that I'm seeing?
Absolutely. And I think it's a pretty simple shift to make to
Mhm.
shift from weekly to monthly services. So that's one immediate thing that you could do is as you're making recommendations, start making recommendations for maybe if you're if you're afraid to move away from a 30-minute, maybe you go to 6 times 30 per month, which would be a small hourly decrease. I think sometimes we forget too that it's our job under the federal IDEA to propose the least restrictive services. And so, which sometimes families too, I think, can feel like we're taking something away from their child. But actually, when we think about a child who's in and out of a classroom and is missing being part of their classroom, that is significant for a small child, especially a child with a disability who might have difficulty with organization and reorienting themselves, getting caught up on the things that they're missing. So I think if we can look at it from the child's perspective and help educate the families around, I'm seeing them for 3 hours in a month as a that's a difference of 1 hour in a month. but then I'm going to be able to have more time to make it more relevant to what they're doing in the classroom. That's actually really impactful when we're actually helping the child and we're following the law. We're doing what we're supposed to do.
Hmm. Yeah, those are all really great points. So, what are some immediate things that SLPs can do if they're feeling stuck?
I think one of the first things is, organizational systems. I don't know if you felt this way, but I felt like every year I was trying like a new system,
Hmm.
something to try. And I really felt like I hit my groove this time, maybe from my years of experience and being an administrator and having more clarity on who I was seeing. But I think you can look at your caseload list and, carefully look at who you're seeing. You know, is it possible that maybe you're overservicing some students? Is it possible that you're seeing some students that actually don't need you? Maybe they need the special ed teacher, or they could do well with a consult service instead of a direct pull out service. you know, can you look at different models of writing your service delivery minutes? Could you investigate, decreasing that time for those articulation students to free up time, for your more heavy hitter students who have more significant disabilities? Thinking about if you're operating in an educational model, and if you're not, can you take some time to educate yourself around what the law is and to feel confident in that? And then I like to streamline my planning. So one of the simplest things is to just look at your caseload and take an I would do like a table of like what students I was seeing for what purpose, so that I could look at the table and just look, do I have the materials I need to address the goals that are in front of me? I didn't do that in my first stint as an SLP, and that was a game changer for me in my second stint, because I could start to see categories and groups of kids based on the same issue that they were having, and it streamlined my planning so beautifully, where I knew I needed sets for these types of skills that I could easily pull from as I was working through I use a literacy-based approach to therapy. Um, so those are just some things off the top of my head.
Yeah, I love those tips. Could you really briefly talk about the difference between the medical and the educational model? Just some like major differences between the two.
So as an educationally based SLP, my role is to ensure a student has access to their educational program. So educational program is kind of a general term depending on the child. So we have our students who have more significant disabilities, and then we have students who are in more of an inclusion environment. And so their educational program could be very different. So I'm looking through an educational lens for access. So that means I can't do assessment in isolation. I can't just do the self, look at low scores and decide this child qualifies, because I don't have any data on their ability to access their current curriculum or their classroom environment. You have to connect those two things. And there's lots of ways that you can do that. So I think that is really critical when we think about being a school-based SLP under an educational model in that organization. Medically, when I was a medically based in a rehab, I was really looking at activities of daily living and quality of life. So I could qualify a student for a long time. I did 2 jobs. I was by day a school based SLP, and by night I worked at a local rehab. And I could qualify and would pick up students medically that I would not pick up educationally. Some of the simplest examples are articulation, because a student who has an articulation error clearly has an educational error, articulation error. But if it's not impacting them, their ability to get to communicate with the teacher, peers, with reading or writing, that child doesn't qualify in an educational model because there's no educational impact. I could pick that child up every day at the rehab because there's a quality of life, and an insurance would cover that. So those are really important. In the schools, I would provide intervention services for those types of students, but then it's not a big IUP. It's just, a 6 or 8 week program. And then I would cycle them off and then re-pick them up if I needed to, or provide home practice. It gives you a lot more flexibility that way. But I think that's a really clear example of this child just doesn't qualify under the educational framework or model. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and I love the example too. I think that's really and I think that there's a lot that is up for interpretation possibly if we're talking about like other examples, and it's probably case by case as well. Like a child who stutters versus a child with, dysphagia, feeding and swallowing disorders. What does that look
Yeah.
like between those two settings as well? So again, I think that that's a whole nother conversation, but I love the example you gave about the Arctic student or client. So thank you for that. Laura, this has been awesome. And I'm sure people are going to want to get your resource, take a look at your YouTube. So can you tell everybody where they can find and connect with you?
Yeah, right now primarily on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and just search my name, Dr. Laura Mansfield, or you can look for me at the Joyful SLP, hopefully you will find me. I would love it if people would subscribe and check out my videos, leave comments, and let me know what other resources they might find supportive for them and the public schools. They can email me directly. I'm at Laura at thejoyfulslp.com. And again, if they want that free guide on qualifying students under an educational model, they can go to www.thejoyfulslp.com/qualify.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Laura. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was a joy to be able to chat with you today.
Thank you so much for listening. By the way, have you joined the SSU crew yet? By joining, you get access to the free good section on our website, plus podcast updates, special event notifications, and therapy inspiration. You can sign up at bit.ly/join SSU crew, all lowercase, or just find the link in this episode description. Also, don't forget to take a screenshot of this episode so that you can always refer back to it and share it on social media if you really love the topic. Take care and remember to always fill your speechy side cup first before you can pour into others.